The cabin was perfect, exactly what Jason and I had hoped for when we decided to spend Christmas away from the chaos of the city. Nestled deep in the woods, it was cozy, quiet, and covered in a thick layer of snow. Everything felt magical, like stepping into a Christmas card. We'd spent the day laughing, drinking hot cocoa, and decorating the little tree in the corner. But as night fell, that magic slowly gave way to something else. Something I can't quite explain. It started out small. I noticed it when Jason was adding another log to the fire. A flicker of movement just outside the large window facing the woods. I told myself it was nothing. A branch swaying, maybe a deer passing by. But when I glanced back at the window, there was nothing there. Just the inky blackness of the forest and the faint reflection of the firelight. "Jason, did you see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up from the fire with a smirk. "What? A scary Christmas squirrel?" I laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the way the darkness pressed against the windows made the cabin feel vulnerable, exposed. Jason brushed it off, and I tried to do the same. But the unease stayed with me. Hours later, we were getting ready for bed when I heard it for the first time. A soft tapping on the living room window. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. "Jason," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He frowned, listening for a moment before shaking his head. "Probably just a branch," and he said, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. He grabbed the flashlight and opened the front door. The cold hit me from across the room as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the icy air. I watched him scan the yard with the beam of light. The snow was untouched, a pristine blanket stretching out into the trees. No footprints, no sign of anyone. "Nothing," he said as he came back inside, locking the door behind him. "See? Just your imagination." But it didn't feel like my imagination. I couldn't explain it, but I knew someone or something was out there. Later that night, the sound came again, this time from the bedroom window. I froze, gripping the edge of the blanket as my pulse thundered in my ears. It was soft at first, almost like a scrape, but it quickly grew louder. Jason turned on the lamp, his face pale. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I got up and walked toward the window. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. "Emma, don't," Jason said behind me, but I had to know. I pulled back the curtain and there it was, a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its grin was the worst part, stretching too wide, like it had been carved into the skin. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. When I finally screamed, the figure vanished. Jason rushed to the window, pulling the curtain wide open. But there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow. No sign anyone had been there at all. Jason tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He double-checked the locks on every door and window before we crawled back into bed. "It's just the isolation," he said. "It's messing with our heads. We'll leave in the morning." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race, and I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see that face again. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the room was deathly quiet. Jason was still asleep beside me, but something had pulled me from my dreams. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to stay in bed, to wake Jason and let him deal with it. But something compelled me to sit up, to turn my head toward the window. And there it was again, that face. Only this time, it was pressed against the glass, its grin even wider, its eyes locked onto mine. I gasped, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The room was empty, the window clear. Jason woke up, startled by my reaction, but when he looked, there was nothing there. He promised we'd leave as soon as the sun came up. The next morning, we packed in silence. Jason went out to load the car, and when he didn't come back right away, I went to check on him. He was standing in the snow, staring at the ground. "Emma," he said quietly, "you need to see this." There, in the fresh snow surrounding the cabin, were footprints. Bare human footprints leading from the woods to the bedroom window. But what made my blood run cold was how they didn't sink into the snow. They just floated on top of it, as if whoever or whatever had made them wasn't walking at all. The tracks led directly to the bedroom window. We left without another word, driving away as fast as the icy roads allowed. But even now, back in the safety of our home, I can't shake the feeling that it followed us. Sometimes late at night, I see the reflection of a face in the window, pale, grinning, and waiting. We spent Christmas at my grandmother's old house, a crumbling Victorian on the edge of a small, forgotten town. It had been abandoned for years, its creaky floors and drafty windows left to gather dust and whispers of the past. My wife Sarah and I thought it would be a quaint adventure, something to laugh about later. It wasn't. The first night was colder than we expected. The old radiators barely worked, and the wind howled through gaps in the windows like a mournful song. After dinner, we huddled by the fire in the parlor. The old house creaked around us, alive with the sounds of age. Then came the singing. It was faint at first, a distant hum, so soft I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. Sarah looked at me, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, holding my breath to listen. The sound grew louder, clearer. It was a melody, soft and slow, like a choir singing a hymn. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from upstairs. We exchanged nervous glances, neither of us wanting to admit what we were thinking. The house had been empty for years. No one else was here, or so we thought. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the narrow staircase. Each step groaned under my weight, the singing growing louder with every step. It was beautiful but wrong, like voices out of sync, drifting through time. When I reached the landing, the music stopped. Silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I shined the flashlight down the hallway, its beam cutting through the darkness. The doors were all closed except one. Grandmother's old bedroom at the end of the hall. The door swayed gently, creaking as if someone had just stepped through it. My pulse thundered as I approached. "Hello!" My voice barely carried, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The room was empty. Dust covered the furniture, and the windows were coated with frost. The air felt thick, cold enough to sting my lungs. Just as I turned to leave, I saw it. Footprints in the dust. Bare footprints leading from the doorway to the closet. They weren't mine. They were too small, like a child's. I ran back downstairs, my heart pounding. Sarah stood by the fire, her face pale. "You heard it again, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, explaining what I saw. She shivered, clutching her sweater tighter. "Maybe we should leave," she said. But the snowstorm outside made that impossible. The roads would be buried by morning. We had no choice but to stay. As the hours dragged on, the singing returned, softer now like a lullaby. Sarah and I sat on the couch, too afraid to move. At midnight, the fire suddenly died, plunging the room into darkness. Then the singing stopped. The silence was worse than the music. It was absolute, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards above us. Someone was moving, slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth. We didn't speak, didn't breathe as the footsteps descended the staircase. I held Sarah's hand, gripping it so tightly I thought I might break her fingers. The steps stopped just outside the parlor door. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice trembling. The door creaked open, but no one entered. The air turned icy, and I could feel something, someone, watching us. Then the singing began again, this time all around us. It was louder, impossibly close, as if the voices were inside the room. Sarah screamed, and I felt her hand wrenched from mine. The room went black, and the last thing I saw was a shadow, a figure standing in the doorway, motionless. When I woke up, the storm had passed, sunlight streaming through the windows. Sarah was gone. Her sweater lay crumpled on the floor beside me. I called her name, searched the house, but she was nowhere to be found. As I stood in the parlor, I heard it again, the singing, faint and distant, coming from the attic. I never went up there. I left the house that day and never returned. Every Christmas since, I hear the faint melody again, drifting on the wind, calling me back,